Okay, so, whoop, I just accidentally blanked the screen there. Okay, so we're going to move away from these granddaddy theories. I skipped over, by the way, I skipped over behaviorism. Your textbook talks about it, but we're going to move away from those granddaddy theories, and let's focus on some more recent theories: trait theories, social cognitive theories, and theories about the self. Okay, so let's start with trait theory. A trait is an enduring quality that makes a person tend to act in a certain way. So enduring quality, one of the things we kind of debate back and forth in psychology is whether this enduring quality is inborn, like were you born with a predisposition to act a certain way, or are these things laid down so early, in infancy and early childhood, that it only seems like they're inborn. We don't really have a full agreement on definitively that question, but the trait theory says that traits are something that can be identified and can be measured. Okay, so that means that we don't need to necessarily have free association and dream interpretation going on to figure out what's in your personality. We can figure out what traits you have using some kind of measurement device that might be administrable by anyone. You don't have to have magical Freud or Freud-trained person to interpret your personality. There's actually a test online that applied trait theory to the U.S. map. People all around the country had taken a personality test, and they actually were able to see patterns in how people answered based on what state. Like different states had different things. The middle of the country is very friendly and conventional. The East Coast tends to be more temperamental and uninhibited. The West Coast tends to be more relaxed and creative. There's a little variation and stuff like that. But the reason why West Virginia is white is because they didn't have any data on West Virginia. So you can kind of see some variations, but overall, states seem to have personalities based on what kinds of people live in different states, right? You know what a trait is. In fact, if I had asked you before I started lecturing on personality to describe your personality, you probably would have given me a series of traits. You're relaxed and creative, you're friendly, you're conventional. You would have given me a list of traits. And that's important because traits differ from person to person. If they didn't, then there'd be no point in developing tests to assess traits, would it? Because if we're all the same, then it's really not interesting. But luckily, we're not all the same. So we can develop tests to identify and measure different traits that people might have, and people will vary on them. Different people will have different traits. So are these traits rooted in biology? Well, I'll tell you what we know, at least, about the biology. In the brain, outgoing people, extroverts, people who are high in like adventure seeking, stuff like that, have lower levels of activity in a particular area. If you look over there on the right, it's pointing at the reticular formation. I mentioned this back in chapter 2, but I'm repeating myself. Extroverts have lower levels of activity in their reticular formation. And so one theory of why they're more likely to listen to louder music, or why extroverts like to go to parties, or why they're more likely to be thrill seekers, jumping out of airplanes, stuff like that, is because lower levels of activity in the reticular formation drives them to want to raise those levels of arousal that are in the reticular formation. So you may seek stimulation. In the body, introverts are more reactive to stimuli. They have a higher autonomic system reactivity. So, of course, this is a dramatic case. She sees a snake, and then, her autonomic nervous system kicks in. But it takes less to activate that in an introvert. And so things that an extrovert wouldn't find arousing, scary or heart pumping or whatever, an introvert would find arousing, scary. Autonomic nervous system kicks in. There's also genes. I mean, if you have dogs of different breeds, you can agree that, we can breed different traits into dogs, into animals, right? So some dogs are higher on aggressiveness, some dogs are higher on sociability, some are higher on calmness. Those personality traits emerged as a function of not only breeding for personality, but also like breeding for coat or size, strength or other qualities, brought along some personality traits as well, like intellect, stuff like that. So if we can breed it in animals, it kind of implies that it must be genetic, right? And if it's genetic in animals, it's probably genetic in people. Okay, so let's talk about Eysenck, which is our first guy to have tried to assert the personality traits might be biologically based. Eysenck went all over the world and administered a series of questions to people in all sorts of different cultures. And he found that certain traits hung together in constellations that really revealed that there are two dimensions to personality. The vertical dimension is the stable-unstable dimension. I'm going to have to pause here for a second. I'll be right back, so hold on. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so he had gone all around the world and he had administered his set of questions to all sorts of different people and discovered these two basic dimensions of personality. The vertical dimension is the stability dimension, and he actually called it neuroticism. I like to call it moodiness, because this dimension really assesses how changeable your traits are, or your mood states are. Within a day, how changeable you are. Like, are you irritable? The horizontal dimension is the introversion-extroversion dimension, and a lot of people simplify those terms to introversion equals shy, extroversion equals outgoing. That's a simplification, but probably good enough for intro to psych, right? So we have these two dimensions, and if you draw them in the way that we have depicted here, you get four basic types of people. You have the people who are introverted and unstable, and then they have those traits that go along with introversion, instability. If you're extroverted, unstable, then you get that list of traits, touchy, restless, changeable, so on. And so you end up with these four different personality types. And the thing that's interesting about Eysenck's personality dimensions is that through this statistical technique called factor analysis, he was able to find these two main dimensions independent of what culture you're reared in, independent of your sex or anything else. These two dimensions seem to exist in all people around the world and vary between people. So we have these two main dimensions. He has this third thing called psychoticism that's really not a dimension. It's more of like he called it the spice that adds to differences among people. He thought that because he observed these two basic dimensions all around the world, independent of culture, that they must be biologically based. That you're probably born with predisposition to be moody and to be either introverted, extroverted, somewhere along that continuum. So probably these are genetic, that probably you were born like this. Now he thought genetic, it's possible also that it could be something having to do with brain development in the womb, which makes it congenital, not genetic. But the point is, you're probably born with these predispositions. Okay, now Eysenck, like I said, he went all around the world and used this factor analysis technique to let the data show him what dimensions there are. On this next slide, the big 5 personality dimensions were discovered using American data. And you'll notice that there's extroversion and there is neuroticism, just like there is on Eysenck's theory. What the big 5 added was 3 more dimensions: conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness. Now, since we were talking about dogs, I thought, well, let's go ahead and use a dog as our example of a personality that we're going to characterize. On conscientiousness, a dog's probably, relative like a human, is probably going to be fairly low, because dogs are pretty impulsive. I've seen them eat pretty gross things. They will run across the street chasing a cat. They're pretty impulsive. They're very agreeable usually. Most of them are pretty agreeable. Even my oldest dog, who we call Grandma, because she's kind of cranky and she's got 2 younger dogs in her. We call them the pack because we got 3 dogs. And Grandma is probably still more agreeable than a disagreeable human. Even though she's the most disagreeable of the 3 dogs because she's cranky and old, she's still, soft-hearted. She's trusting. She's very helpful. She definitely thinks I need her help all the time. Neuroticism, they're probably more on the unstable side, right? They're probably more irritable and reactive. Anxious. I know for sure Grandma is. She is highly anxious, and you know, sometimes it does seem like she's pitying herself, but I don't know if dogs have those kinds of emotions, self-pitying. But how open are they to new experience? Well, dogs are kind of conforming. They like routine. They like the same thing to happen every single day. Um, as I'm talking to you, it's November 1st, which is tonight we're going to be changing the clocks back. And the dogs are going to have a hard time with the time change because they are accustomed to eating dinner at 5 o'clock, and it will be 5 o'clock at the wrong time for them because they can't actually read the clock. They go, I think, based on light, and they like routine. Extroversion. They tend to be pretty fun-loving, pretty sociable, right? Very affectionate. Some of our dogs are more affectionate than others, but it's one of those examples of traits that dogs vary on, right? So mostly dogs fall high on the fun-loving and sociable component, right? Okay, so but you can imagine applying this to yourself, that you probably, vary, and you'll notice this is drawn with double-headed arrows to show you that these are continuums, that you could place yourself anywhere along the continuum from disorganized, careless, impulsive to organized, careful, discipline. You could be anywhere in between, right? Now this data, like I said, was generated from an American sample, and so Eysenck said, well, I think you're tapping into characteristics that are culturally influenced, and I tapped into things that are biologically influenced. So that's a debate that's been going on among the group, of personality researchers. I wanted to say one more thing about well, actually, I want to say a couple of things. If you look at the italicized first letters of conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, extroversion, you'll notice it spells out the word canoe. So that's a nice mnemonic device for remembering the 5 dimensions. If you think to yourself canoe and then just remember what the letters might represent, then that's kind of a nice mnemonic. The other thing I wanted to mention is that extroversion and neuroticism are very stable traits, and so that helps to support Eysenck's interpretation that they might be biologically based, that they might be innate. Conscientiousness is a very stable trait. If you were a conscientious child, you're probably a conscientious adult. And that it's, if you're conscientious in one area of your life, you're probably conscientious in other areas of your life. The ones that are changeable seem to be agreeableness and openness. For most of you who are, younger adults, you're in probably your peak openness phase. Usually openness starts to decline somewhere around age 40 for most people. It may be tied to reproduction and child rearing and things like that, and sort of your need to explore and see a variety and stuff. When you're stuck on a treadmill, it's a good thing that your openness scores start going down, right? Because you're like, I just got to get keep everything afloat right now. So openness tends to peak in young adulthood, and it starts to wane as we get older. Agreeableness tends to peak as we get older. So we tend to be less agreeable when we're younger, and as we age, we become more and more agreeable. Fewer things bother us, for one thing, as we get older. But we also start to get more trusting as we get older, and it's kind of an interesting inversion of what you might think, because with experience, you would think that you would learn not to trust people. But one of the unfortunate things about the elderly is they oftentimes get scammed because they trust people who call and say that they're from the bank, or things like that. They'll trust people and give them their information over the phone in ways that younger people know better than to do because they aren't as trusting. Older people are more soft-hearted and more willing to share what they have with people who they perceive to be in greater need, stuff like that. So extroversion, neuroticism, and conscientiousness tend to be very stable. Agreeable and openness vary with age. Okay, now here we have trait score correlations in a longitudinal study where people got tested every 7 years. And what you see is that as you age, okay, so what we're looking at here is something I've taught you guys before, which is concordance rates. So your concordance rates can range from 0 to 1. The lower the number, the less the 2 scores matched. The higher the number, the more the two scores matched. So here we have children who were tested at 7 years apart, and what they found is if I gave you the Eysenck scale to figure out what your personality was like when you were 7 and then give it to you again when you were 14, there might be a pretty significant change in your score. The concordance rate is only 0.3. By the time you're in college, it's starting to become more stable. So from one time to the next, you would score roughly the same. 30 years old, it's getting even more consistent. By the time you're in mid to older adulthood, the consistency of scores will be really, really high. People start to become more and more themselves the older they get. They start to be much more consistent in their approach to the world. Kids are much more variable than adults are in the way that they express their personalities. So there's my little characterization of this chart. Traits change, but less with age. The older we get, the less our traits change. We become more and more stably consistent as we age. All right, let's go ahead and take a little break here, and we will come back and talk about the personality situation interaction.